A man sits alone on a park bench at 2 a.m., looking like he hasn't slept in days. His clothes are wrinkled, his hair disheveled. To everyone passing by, he looks like just another person down on their luck. But what happens next will shake you to your core. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight. Sarah Martinez pulled her coat tighter as she hurried down Fifth Avenue, her heels clicking against the wet pavement like a frantic metronome. She was already 20 minutes late for her shift at the all-night diner, and her manager had made it crystal clear that one more tardiness would mean looking for a new job. But then she saw him. Sitting on the park bench across from the subway entrance was a figure that made her slow her pace. A man in his 50s, maybe older, with shoulder-length dark hair that clung to his face like wet curtains. His black jacket was soaked through, and his jeans had seen better decades. He sat perfectly still, staring at nothing, as if the world around him had simply ceased to exist. Sarah's first instinct was to keep walking. New York City had taught her that lesson early. Don't make eye contact, don't engage, just keep moving. But something about this man was different. Maybe it was the way he held himself, with a quiet dignity that seemed untouchable even in his apparent despair. Or maybe it was the fact that he wasn't asking for anything from anyone. He was just there. She checked her phone. 23 minutes late now. The smart thing would be to keep walking. The safe thing. The normal thing. Instead, she found herself crossing the street. "Excuse me," she said softly, approaching the bench. "Are you okay?" The man looked up, and Sarah felt her breath catch. His eyes were the color of deep water, and there was something achingly familiar about his face. But more than that, there was a sadness there that seemed to reach right through her chest and squeeze her heart. "I'm fine," he said simply, his voice carrying a gentleness that didn't match his rough appearance. "Thank you for asking." Sarah studied his face more carefully. There was definitely something familiar about him, but she couldn't place it. Maybe he was someone from her neighborhood, or maybe he just had one of those faces that reminded you of someone else. "You're soaked to the bone," she observed. "And it's getting colder." He smiled then, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "I've been wetter." Sarah glanced around. The street was nearly empty, except for the occasional taxi and a few other late-night wanderers. The diner where she worked was only 2 blocks away, and she could see its warm yellow glow beckoning to her. Her manager was probably already writing up her termination paperwork. But she couldn't just leave him there. "Look," she said, sitting down on the edge of the bench. "I work at Mickey's Diner just down the street. Why don't you come get some coffee? Get dry for a bit." The man studied her face with an intensity that made her feel like he was reading her entire life story in her eyes. "That's very kind of you," he said finally. "But I couldn't impose." "It's not imposing if I'm offering. You don't know me." "No," Sarah agreed. "But I know what it's like to be alone in the rain." Something shifted in his expression then, like a wall coming down brick by brick. "You're going to be late for work," he observed, nodding toward her diner uniform visible beneath her coat. "I'm already late," Sarah said with a shrug. "What's a few more minutes?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could practically see him wrestling with some internal debate. Finally he stood up, water dripping from his clothes like he'd just emerged from a swimming pool. "All right," he said. "But I'm buying you coffee. Deal?" They walked the 2 blocks in comfortable silence, their footsteps creating small splashes in the puddles that had formed in every crack and crevice of the sidewalk. Sarah stole glances at him as they walked, that nagging sense of familiarity growing stronger with each step. Mickey's Diner was a relic from the 1950s, all chrome and red vinyl, the kind of place that looked like it had been frozen in time. At this hour, it was mostly empty except for a few insomniacs, taxi drivers grabbing quick meals, and the occasional partygoer sobering up with greasy food. "Sarah," called out Tony, the night manager, as soon as she walked through the door. His face was flushed with irritation, but when he saw her companion, his expression shifted to one of barely concealed disgust. "You're 30 minutes late, and you're bringing friends." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "Tony," It's fine, the man said quietly, placing a gentle hand on her arm. I should go. No, Sarah said firmly, turning to face Tony with a look that could have melted steel. You're staying. Tony, this gentleman is a customer. You know, those people who keep this place in business. Tony looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Sarah's tone warned him off. Fine, he muttered. But you're still late. And I'll stay late to make up for it. Sarah replied sweetly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a customer to serve. She led the man to a booth in the corner, as far away from Tony's disapproving glare as possible. The vinyl seats squeaked as they sat down, and Sarah couldn't help but notice how out of place her companion looked in the harsh fluorescent lighting. There was something almost ethereal about him, like he belonged in shadows and moonlight, rather than the unforgiving brightness of a 24-hour diner. I'm sorry about Tony, she said as she grabbed 2 menus from the holder on the table. He's usually not that. Well, actually, he is usually exactly that awful. The man smiled again, that same sun-through-clouds expression that seemed to transform his entire face. Don't worry about it. I've encountered worse. I'm Sarah, by the way, she said, extending her hand across the table. He took it, and his grip was firm and warm, despite the fact that he'd been sitting in the rain for who knows how long. He paused for just a moment, so briefly that Sarah almost missed it. John. Nice to meet you, John. Sarah poured coffee from the pot she'd grabbed on the way to the table, the rich aroma filling the space between them. John wrapped his hands around the mug like it was a lifeline, and she noticed that his fingers were long and elegant, the hands of an artist or a musician. So, she said, settling back in her seat, what brings you to a park bench in the rain at 2 in the morning? John took a long sip of his coffee before answering. Sometimes you just need to sit and think. Rain makes good thinking weather. Heavy thoughts, the heaviest. Sarah nodded, understanding more than he probably knew. I get that. I do my best thinking during the night shift here. Something about the quiet hours, you know. When the rest of the world is asleep, it feels like you can finally hear yourself think. Exactly. John's eyes lit up with something that might have been surprise. Most people don't understand that. Most people are afraid of quiet. They fell into silence then, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who recognize something in each other, a shared understanding of what it means to be awake when the world is sleeping. After a few minutes, John spoke again. What about you? What brings you to the night shift at a diner? Sarah laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. The glamorous life of a struggling actress in New York City. Day jobs are harder to come by when you need to be available for auditions that might never come. You're an actress, trying to be. Been trying for 3 years now. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just fooling myself. John studied her face with that same intense focus he'd shown earlier. What kind of acting? Theater, mostly. Some small film stuff when I can get it. I did a commercial for laundry detergent once. That was not my finest artistic moment. Theater's tough. The audiences are right there. You can't hide behind editing or multiple takes. Sarah looked at him with new interest. You sound like you know something about it. I've been around it a bit. Before Sarah could ask more, Tony appeared at their table like a bad omen. Sarah, table 4 needs their check, and the coffee station needs refilling. I'll be right there, Sarah said through gritted teeth. Actually, John said, reaching into his jacket pocket. We should probably settle up anyway. He pulled out a wallet that looked like it had seen as many miles as he had, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip a beat. Just for a second, when he opened it to pull out money, she saw the corner of what looked like a driver's license, and on it, she could swear she saw the name Keanu Reeves. But that was impossible. Keanu Reeves didn't sit on park benches in the rain at 2 in the morning. Keanu Reeves didn't look like he'd been sleeping rough. And Keanu Reeves certainly didn't introduce himself as John to a waitress in a diner. She must have been seeing things. John, or whoever he was, placed a $20 bill on the table for 2 cups of coffee that cost a total of $4.
That's too much, Sarah protested. It's exactly right, he said, standing up. Thank you, Sarah, for the coffee and the conversation. Wait, she said, suddenly desperate not to let this strange, kind man disappear back into the night. Will I see you again? He paused at the edge of the table, and for a moment, she thought she saw something vulnerable cross his features. Maybe, the city's smaller than people think. He turned to go, but Sarah called out to him. John. He looked back. Whatever those heavy thoughts are, she said, I hope they get lighter. He smiled one more time, and then he was gone, disappearing into the night, like he'd never been there at all. Sarah stood there for a moment, staring at the door he'd walked through, that nagging sense of familiarity, still tugging at the edges of her mind. She picked up the $20 bill, and underneath it, she found something that made her hands tremble. It was a business card, simple and elegant, with just a phone number and a single line of text. For when the thoughts get too heavy. She turned the card over, and on the back, in neat handwriting, were the words, The Matrix Auditions, Thursday, 2 p.m. Ask for Karen. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sat down hard in the booth. She pulled out her phone, and did what she should have done. The moment she felt that sense of recognition, she Googled, Keanu Reeves, 2024. The first image that came up was a recent paparazzi photo of the actor, looking remarkably similar to the man who had just been sitting across from her, albeit in better clothes, and without the weight of whatever sadness he'd been carrying. Her hands were shaking as she looked up The Matrix Auditions, and found a casting call that had been posted just that morning for a new film in the franchise. Supporting roles, looking for unknown actors. The kind of opportunity that struggling actresses like Sarah Martinez dreamed about but never actually got. She looked at the card again, then at the $20 bill, then at the door he'd disappeared through. Keanu Reeves had been sitting on a park bench in the rain, looking like he'd lost everything, and instead of asking for help, he'd given it. He'd sat in a diner with a stranger who showed him kindness, and in return, he'd potentially changed her entire life. But why had he been out there in the first place? What were those heavy thoughts he'd been carrying? Sarah pulled out her phone and did another search, this time for recent news about Keanu Reeves. What she found made her heart ache. 3 days earlier, there had been reports about a charity event he'd been planning for homeless veterans, a project he'd been working on for months. The funding had fallen through at the last minute, leaving hundreds of people without the help they'd been promised. The articles mentioned how personally affected he'd been by the failure, how he'd been trying to find alternative funding, and how he'd been spotted around the city looking uncharacteristically disheveled. He hadn't been homeless, he'd been heartbroken, and in that moment of his own pain, when a stranger had shown him simple human kindness, he'd found a way to give back something even greater. Sarah looked at the card one more time, then carefully tucked it into her wallet, next to her own worn driver's license. Tomorrow, she would call that number. She would go to that audition. She would see where this unexpected gift might lead. But tonight, she would finish her shift, and every time someone came through those doors looking like they needed a friend, she would remember the lesson she'd learned from a man who'd introduced himself as John. Sometimes the people who look like they have nothing are actually carrying everything. Sometimes, kindness is a circle that comes back around when you least expect it. And sometimes, the most important conversations happen at 2 in the morning, in a diner that smells like coffee and dreams. As she refilled the coffee station and served table 4 their check, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about that moment when he'd smiled. It really had been like watching the sun break through storm clouds. She never did find out what his heavy thoughts had been that night, but she had a feeling that somehow, in that little diner booth, they'd become just a little bit lighter, and maybe, just maybe, that had been the point all along. 3 weeks later, Sarah Martinez would book her first major film role. But that night, in Mickey's diner, she learned something far more valuable than any career opportunity could provide. That sometimes the most profound acts of kindness happen between strangers who recognize themselves in each other's stories. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to sit down next to someone in the rain, you discover that the person who needed saving was actually you. The man she'd known as John was already 6 blocks away, walking through the empty streets with hands in his pockets, and something that might have been hope flickering in his chest. Tomorrow, he would make some phone calls. He would find another way to fund that project for the veterans. He would turn his heartbreak into action. But tonight, he carried with him the memory of a young woman who'd seen someone she thought needed help and hadn't hesitated to offer it. In a world that often felt dark and disconnected, that simple act of human decency had reminded him why the fight was worth it. Neither of them would ever forget that night, and neither of them would ever know how much they'd saved each other.